They say God hears every prayer, that mothers love their daughters without condition, that innocence is its own defense. And I believed all three with the faith of someone who had nothing else to anchor herself to. Believed even as I knelt on cold stone floors, begging forgiveness for sins I had not committed. Believed even as my mother's face hardened with each passing year. Believed even as the village looked at me with eyes that saw monster, where I only ever tried to be good. And I was 17 when I finally understood that everything I believed was wrong. 17 when the truth revealed itself in a way so devastating that it rewrote my entire past. Made me see every moment of my life through a lens that transformed victim into something far more complicated. And what I learned that night changed not just who I was, but who I had always been, though I had been too blind to see it. My name is Constance Reed, and I was born in Salem in 1675, during a winter so harsh that 3 infants died in the same week I drew my first breath. And my mother, Margaret, told me later that the midwife had whispered I should have been the 4th. That something about my birth was wrong. That I had come too easily for a first child. That my eyes had opened too soon and looked at her with awareness that newborns should not possess. And my mother had dismissed these concerns, because what mother wants to believe her child is cursed? But she remembered them, carried them, let them color every moment of my childhood, until those whispers became the foundation of how she saw me. I was different from other children in ways I could not hide, knew things before they happened, felt other people's pain as if it were my own, heard voices in the wind that spoke truths I was too young to understand. And I thought everyone experienced the world this way. Thought it was normal to know when someone was lying, to feel the sickness in a body before symptoms showed, to see the shadows that clung to certain people like harbingers of death. And when I spoke of these things, my mother's face would close like a door, would harden into an expression I learned to dread. And she would take me to our room and make me pray, would make me beg God to remove the devil's influence. And I prayed because I loved her, because I wanted to be the daughter she could love back, because I believed with desperate certainty that if I could just be good enough, pure enough, devoted enough, she would look at me with warmth instead of fear. The prayers started when I was 5 and continued every day of my life. Hours spent kneeling until my knees were bruised black, reciting scripture until the words lost meaning, begging forgiveness for being what I was. And my mother would watch with an expression that I read as concern, but that I now understand was something else entirely. Something I was too innocent to recognize. And she would say the devil had his claws in me deep. That only constant vigilance would keep me from damnation. That she was doing this because she loved me. Because losing me to darkness was unthinkable. And I believed her because children believe their mothers. Because the alternative was too terrible, was being unwanted, was being alone. The discipline came when I was 8. Came after I touched a dying cat in the garden, and it had gotten up and walked away. Came after my mother saw what I had done, and something in her face broke. And she brought out the whip of knotted cords, and she made me use it on my own back. Made me strike myself while she counted. And she said this was necessary. This was love. This was the only way to drive out what lived inside me. And I did it because I thought she was right. Thought the pain was purification. Thought that enough suffering would transform me into someone she could love without reservation. And my back became a lattice of scars that I wore like a map of devotion. Proof that I was trying. Proof that I wanted to be good. My father was a shadow in my childhood. A merchant who was often away. And when he was home, he was silent. Would look at me with an expression I could not read. Something between pity and disgust. And he never intervened when my mother made me pray or use the discipline. never questioned her methods, and I thought he agreed with her, thought he too believed I was corrupted. But now I understand his silence meant something different, meant complicity of another kind, meant knowing and choosing not to act, which is its own form of cruelty. I had no friends because my mother did not allow me to play with other children, said they would corrupt me or I would corrupt them, said isolation was protection, and I spent my childhood alone except for her. Alone with my prayers and my pain and the growing certainty that I was fundamentally wrong. That something essential about my existence was an affront to God and nature. And I tried so desperately to fix myself, to become someone worthy of love, to transform the thing I was into something acceptable. But the power did not leave. It grew stronger, more insistent. And the more I suppressed it, the more it hurt, like holding my breath until my lungs burned, like swallowing screams until my throat bled. I was 15 when Pastor Williams came to our house. Came because my mother had requested his counsel, had told him she feared for my soul, and he questioned me for hours, asked about my visions, my knowledge, my power, and I confessed everything, because I had been taught that confession was the path to redemption. And he listened with a face like carved stone. And when I finished, he said I was either touched by God or by Satan, and discerning which required testing. And my mother agreed immediately, too quickly, with an eagerness that should have warned me. And they took me to the meeting house cellar. And for 3 days Pastor Williams performed tests. Tests that involved pain and deprivation and questions designed to trap rather than illuminate. And at the end, he said he could not determine the source of my power. That I should continue to pray, to mortify my flesh, to seek God's grace. And he told my mother to be vigilant. And I saw relief in her face. Relief that the responsibility of determining my fate had been passed back to her. And I did not understand then why she would be relieved, why having a daughter of uncertain spiritual status would please her. The answer came 2 years later, came on the night of my 17th birthday, came when I overheard my mother speaking to someone in our parlor. And I crept down the stairs and I heard her voice, heard her say that the girl had proven useful, that the demonstration had been convincing, that she had cultivated the symptoms carefully over 17 years. And I heard another voice, a woman's voice I did not recognize, say that 17 years was a long time to maintain such a deception. And my mother laughed, actually laughed, and said it had been easier than expected, that children were malleable, that I had been so desperate for love I would believe anything, that the discipline and the prayers had been theater, designed to make me believe I was corrupted, when in fact I was simply sensitive, simply gifted with abilities that could be useful if properly controlled. And the woman said, "And you're certain she doesn't know?" And my mother said she's convinced she's cursed, convinced she's fighting demonic influence, convinced that everything she is must be suppressed, which makes her perfect. Makes her a weapon that believes it's broken, when it's actually exactly what we need. I stood on the stairs, and I felt my entire world invert. Felt every moment of my past reveal itself as lie. Felt 17 years of pain and prayer and desperate devotion recontextualize into something so profoundly evil I could barely comprehend it. And I understood that my mother had not been trying to save me, but to break me. Had not been fighting my corruption, but creating it. Had spent 17 years convincing me I was demon-touched so that I would never question her. Never realize that what I had was not curse, but gift. Never understand that she was not protecting me, but grooming me. Shaping me into something she could use. And the worst part, the part that made me want to scream, was that it had worked. I had spent 17 years hating myself, hurting myself, begging forgiveness for existing, and she had watched it all with satisfaction, had measured my pain as proof of success. I heard them move toward the stairs, and I fled back to my room. And I lay in my bed with my heart pounding and my mind racing. And I understood that I had to leave. That staying meant becoming whatever weapon she intended me to be. Meant continuing to live a lie that had consumed my entire childhood. And I waited until the house was silent. Until I was certain both my mother and her guest were asleep. And I gathered what little I owned and I left. Left through the window I had never been allowed to open. Left the only home I had ever known. Left the mother who had spent 17 years destroying me while calling it love. I went to the forest because I had nowhere else to go. And I walked until exhaustion forced me to stop. And I collapsed against a tree, and I wept for the childhood I had lost. For the mother I had never actually had. For the 17 years I had spent believing I was broken when I was simply being broken. And I wept too with rage. Rage at the deception. Rage at my own blindness. Rage at how thoroughly she had convinced me to participate in my own destruction. And that rage was cleansing. Was the first pure emotion I had felt in 17 years. Was the beginning of understanding who I actually was beneath the layers of shame and fear she had built around me. I lived in the forest for weeks. Lived on berries and stream water. And slowly, carefully, I began to test my power without the weight of her disapproval. Without the belief that using it was sin. And I discovered it was not corruption, but connection. Not demonic, but natural. Not something to suppress, but something to understand. And I practiced in secret. Learned to heal intentionally rather than accidentally. Learned to sense things before they happened. Learned to hear the old voices that had always been there, but that I had been taught to silence. And I felt myself becoming someone new, someone whole. Someone who did not need to apologize for existing. The truth about my mother's plan revealed itself slowly. Revealed itself through whispers I caught when I ventured near the village edges. Through fragments of conversation between people who did not know I was listening. And I learned that she was part of something larger. A group of women who practiced the old ways but in secret. Who used their power not to help but to control. Who positioned themselves within communities as righteous Christians, while actually serving older purposes. And they needed young witches, needed girls who were powerful but broken, who could be controlled through shame and fear, who would do what they were told because they believed they were damaged and needed guidance. And my mother had been raising me to be exactly that. Had been breaking me systematically, so that when the time came I would be obedient, would be grateful for direction, would never question because I had spent 17 years learning not to trust my own judgment. I could have run further, could have disappeared into the wilderness and never looked back. But something in me refused to let her win completely, refused to leave without her knowing that I knew, that her 17 years of careful cultivation had failed, that I had escaped, and I went back to Salem. Went back on the night of the new moon when power was strongest. And I went to our house. And I walked through the door I had left through the window. And I found my mother in the parlor with 3 other women. And they looked up when I entered, and my mother's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, then fear, then calculation. And she opened her mouth to speak, to explain or command or manipulate, but I spoke first. I told her I knew, told her I had heard everything. Told her that I understood what she had done and what she had intended. And I told her too that it had failed. That I was not the weapon she had tried to create, but something else entirely. Something she could not control or predict or use. And I told her that I forgave her. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hate for her would be carrying part of her with me. And I wanted nothing of hers. wanted to be free of her completely. And then I left while she sat frozen, left before she could respond, left knowing I would never see her again and not caring. And I walked back into the forest, and I never returned. The witch trials came to Salem 5 years later, came with the same hysteria that had destroyed women for generations. And I heard that my mother was among the accused, that someone had finally spoken against her, that the careful mask she had worn for decades had slipped. And I heard that she was tried and convicted and hanged. And I felt nothing, not satisfaction or grief or closure, just a distant acknowledgement that someone who had hurt me was gone, and the world continued exactly as before. And I continued with it, continued practicing what I was, continued helping when I chose and hiding when I must, continued being alive when she had tried to make me believe I should not be. I learned later from a woman who had known her that my mother had not been trying to create a weapon for some grand purpose, but for something simpler and more pathetic. She had been trying to prove herself valuable to the coven she served, had been trying to demonstrate her dedication by offering them a daughter perfectly broken and perfectly controlled, had been competing with other women to show whose methods were most effective. And I had been the proof of concept, the demonstration project, and my entire childhood had been about her ambition, her need to be seen as powerful and competent, and I was the price she paid for that ambition, the sacrifice she made to women who ultimately betrayed her just as she had betrayed me. This is my confession, and the truth it contains is more complex than simple betrayal. Because I learned that my mother's mother had done the same to her, had raised her with the same methods, the same breaking, the same cultivation of shame and fear, and my mother had simply continued a cycle she did not know how to break, had inflicted on me what had been inflicted on her, had created in me the weapon she had once been, and this knowledge does not excuse her, but it complicates her, makes her simultaneously perpetrator and victim, makes my rage at her more difficult because beneath the monster was a woman who had never been shown another way. And I wonder sometimes if she thought she was doing what mothers were supposed to do. If she genuinely believed that breaking your daughter was the same as loving her, because that was what she had been taught love looked like. I carry this understanding not as forgiveness, but as truth. Carry the knowledge that harm perpetuates itself through generations, unless someone chooses to stop it. And I chose to stop it. Chose to be the generation that broke rather than continuing to break others. And perhaps that is the truest revenge. Not destruction, but transformation. Not continuing the cycle, but ending it. Not becoming what she tried to make me, but becoming something entirely new. And I am alive and whole and powerful not despite her, but in defiance of her. And every day I exist is proof that her methods failed. That love cannot be replaced with pain. That 17 years of breaking someone does not guarantee they will stay broken. And that sometimes the daughter you tried to destroy becomes something far more dangerous than any weapon you tried to create. Becomes a woman who knows exactly what you did and chooses mercy, not because you deserve it, but because carrying your hate would make her you. And I refuse absolutely to become anything like what you were.